So as a kind of basic introduction, I always like to tell a little story about communication surveillance. Surveillance isn't new. States have always been interested in understanding what progressive movements or dissidents or people who are just representing another way of thinking are wanting to do. And they also, want to track criminals as well. So the practice of surveillance is never really, it's not something that's necessarily a new phenomenon. The first, reading all the way back, the first kind of documented big piece of surveillance and a scandal was involving an Italian called Guiseppe Mazzini in like 1789. Guiseppe Mazzini was living in London, exiled from Italy, and he was writing about how the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time was dominating politics, and there needed to be a new way to, govern ourselves and to think about how things can be formed. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they were kind of curious about what Giuseppe was doing and writing and thinking, so they asked the UK government to start intercepting his letters. So Giuseppe would be, he was a man writing letters, sending them to all of his different friends. And so the UK government created what was called the Special Department, the Secret Department of the Post Office, which would intercept all of Giuseppe's letters as they were going. So he became suspicious about this. So one day he was writing a letter and he added some sunflower seeds and like lavender petals to the envelope. And then when the intended recipient received the letter, he was like, "Well, did you get anything else in the envelope?" And they're like, "No, it was empty." So for Giuseppe, that was proof that his document had been opened and someone had read it. And so that brought about a massive scandal in the Parliament because the Special Department of the Post Office was completely secret. No one knew it had been created. It was created in secret. There was no parliamentary discussion about whether or not they wanted it. And so this was like the first big surveillance scandal that took place about states operating secretly, intercepting people's messages, operating away from democracy and away from the transparent democratic procedures. Surveillance isn't a new phenomenon. But the technologies that perform surveillance and the networks that surveillance is performed on are new, and that has changed drastically. We're not writing letters that we can put sunflower seeds and lavender petals in anymore. We're playing in a different game with electronic communications and the amount of data that we're transmitting that we didn't even know we were transmitting. And that has changed the situation drastically. So surveillance is sometimes a game of PR. It's a publicity game. It's about how you can present the topic. Normally, the state would like you to think that this is what the totality of surveillance is. So here we have there's a person's house. There's one phone line coming out of it, and then there is a tap. That red line there is a tap on that person's phone line. None of these other people are affected. They're just focusing on this one person. They're just taking the information from that. They use words like targeted, discrete, limited, all of these kind of things. And that's pretty much how you're supposed to accept surveillance as being what is capable of in surveillance and how the state goes about it. But that's no longer the case. We're still talking about the same networks. So that phone line that we were talking about that was coming out of that one person's house, we're still talking about that. That's what this is, the PSTN. But instead of talking about one house, we're talking about a city or a country. That's how capable surveillance technology has become. You could be intercepting. If there was better, so as you can see there, this is actually from a South African company called Vastec, who sell this type of technology, a massive monitoring system, and they say themselves you can intercept all traffic that's coming out of whole countries with their technology. And Vastec means this. Vastec sold this equipment to Gaddafi. And this was used to record 50 million minutes of phone calls every single month in Libya. And when Gaddafi fell and the Ministry of Interior fell in Libya, they broke down the doors and they were running down the corridors, these long corridors, and they found just the whole corridor stacked floor to ceiling with dossiers, all transcripts of people's conversations. And people were grabbing them and they were finding their own copies. And they were finding copies of their friends. And in some cases, they were finding copies of their friends who are disappeared and who were dead as well. You suddenly kind of realize that this kind of thing, when we start to just talk about technology in an abstract sense, when they're running down those corridors and finding those transcripts, they really realize that the visceral nature and the very real threat that a state with complete control and no accountability can do with surveillance. So when we talk about communication surveillance technologies at PI and with other people, we normally break it down into two categories. We got network and we got tactical. So network is like physical probes, big chunky machines, kind of like what we were talking about there with Vastec. You have to sort of attach them to a line, to a cable. Sometimes you're just attaching it to a cable. Sometimes you're communicating with the provider, like with Indosat. And it's Indosat's network that is being modified to allow surveillance to take place. And then the other side of things, which is a growing area and slightly more concerning, is the tactical. So that doesn't require a physical presence. That doesn't require a crocodile clip attached to a line. It doesn't require necessarily communication with Indosat or telecommunications firms. You could be doing it without any physical presence and doing it without even looking at communications networks, but instead focusing on devices, as we'll see later. So to do a bit of network surveillance, this is what we call a mediation platform. This is sold by a German company called Utimaco. This is the idea of the communications provider modifying their network to allow for surveillance to take place. So with this blue box there, this is effectively a kind of bridge between the provider and law enforcement. So we say the national police want to get Wayudi's information. And they want to do it lawfully because Wayudi's not been behaving and there's a genuine concern. Not that you're in that position now, Wayudi. So, law enforcement, in the best case scenario, would go to a judge, ask for a judicial authorization to request information to be provided to request Wayudi's information to be provided by Indosat. The judge signs it, balancing up on principles like necessity, legitimacy, proportionality, that we could talk about more. Law enforcement takes that order and they deliver it to, they would actually use this system to deliver it to Indosat. Indosat would retrieve it, they would look at it, they would go and retrieve the information within their network and then push it back through their network and through that bridge back to law enforcement. It's a multi-step process. It's got lots of actors involved in it, like a judge, hopefully, like telecommunications providers. So actually, for us, this is probably the best way to go about it. This is the most legitimate way that surveillance can take place. You're talking about a collaborative framework where the order has to be served on the operator. The operator has lawyers that can look over it. They could even challenge it in the best case scenario. The content's delivered through the network. So again, there's more technical oversight. So Indosat are able to administer and track how that information is moving to make sure that it's just Wayudi's and it doesn't go to Fadli's or anything like that. But having said that, the questions still have to be asked about the procedure. And in Indonesia, it seems like the problem is just the number of powers that are available. So I think what were the numbers? There's 12 laws, 2 government regulators, and 2 ministerial regulations as well that have some kind of surveillance capacity. And they can't all be perfect, unfortunately. That's just the law of averages. That is a lot of different powers. Could be very confusing for a telecommunication provider to know what they are allowed to push back on, what is lawful, what is not lawful. I don't know if you wanted, if anybody has more information or wants to talk a bit more about the legal framework, that we can do that. But yeah, so the big thing in Indonesia, it seems, is just the breadth of powers and the many different areas that it sits in, the different pieces of legislation. Maybe something to work on, that we want to get one piece of legislation that puts clear rules in place about who can undertake surveillance and on what grounds. And so this mediation platform, it's pretty much able to operate on any kind of network. So we had our basic phone line there, but if you're using IP or using mobile, ultimately these kind of platforms are all very similar.